Blood is a terrible indicator of a person's true nature. It all looks exactly the same on the pristine linoleum of a trauma ward, regardless of whose veins it came from. To the overworked staff at St. Jude's Medical Center in downtown Seattle, Amelia Hayes was just the quiet new hire, a woman who spoke softly, obsessively double-checked her charts, and faded into the sterile background of the chaotic emergency department. She was ordinary, invisible, but when 6 heavily armed mercenaries breached the ER doors on a rainy Tuesday night, shattering the security glass and the illusion of safety, they made one fatal miscalculation. They assumed Amelia was just a nurse. They were dead wrong. The rain in Seattle that November didn't just fall. It assaulted the pavement. It battered the thick, reinforced windows of St. Jude's Medical Center, creating a drumming soundtrack to the relentless hum of the emergency department. Inside, the air tasted faintly of bleach, iodine, and the metallic tang of anxiety that always lingered in triage. Amelia Hayes adjusted the earpieces of her Littman cardiology IV stethoscope, her face a mask of serene concentration, as she listened to the rhythmic, wet crackle in the lungs of an elderly pneumonia patient in Bay 2. Amelia was 34, with mousy brown hair tied back in a sensible, unremarkable ponytail, and a uniform that always seemed a half size too large, successfully obscuring her frame. She had been at St. Jude's for exactly 3 weeks. In that time, she had earned a reputation as competent, polite, and entirely forgettable. "I'm telling you, Amelia, administration is going to cut our overtime again," whispered Elena Carmichael, the veteran charge nurse, leaning against the nurse's station with a cup of lukewarm, bitter coffee. Elena was a woman who lived for the hospital's internal politics. "Did you see the memo Dr. Sterling sent out? Wants us turning over beds in under 20 minutes? As if we aren't already running on fumes." Amelia offered a mild, sympathetic smile. "It's definitely been a busy week, Elena." Her voice was soft, devoid of any sharp edges. "Busy is an understatement," Elena scoffed, adjusting her glasses. She gestured with her chin toward the double doors of Bay 4, which were currently flanked by 2 large men in cheap off-the-rack suits. "And now we're playing babysitter to the feds. Have you been in there yet?" Amelia nodded slowly. "Just to check his IV lines. He's stable." The patient in Bay 4 was listed as John Doe, but the hospital rumor mill had already identified him as David Corliss, a high-level forensic accountant who had recently decided to turn state's evidence against a major West Coast syndicate. Corliss had arrived via a Seattle Fire Department ambulance 4 hours earlier, with a through-and-through gunshot wound to the shoulder, a warning shot, the whisperers said. Now, 2 United States Marshals, Agents Miller and Davis, stood guard outside his glass-walled cubicle, looking profoundly bored and heavily caffeinated. Amelia walked over to the Pyxis Med station to pull a routine dose of antibiotics. As she keyed in her passcode, her eyes didn't focus on the screen. Instead, using the reflective surface of the monitor, she casually scanned the room. It was a habit she hadn't bothered to break, even in her new life. While Elena saw an overworked ER, Amelia saw a tactical grid. She knew there were exactly 5 exits from the triage floor. She knew the structural load-bearing walls were located between bays 3 and 4. She knew Agent Miller favored his right leg, indicating an old injury, and that his Glock 19 was holstered clumsily on his hip, the retention strap unfastened. She knew Agent Davis was currently distracted, scrolling through his iPhone, completely oblivious to his blind spot near the linen carts. Amelia retrieved the medication, her face blank. She wasn't an auditor for the Joint Commission, nor was she a security consultant. But the ingrained instincts of a woman who had spent a decade operating in the world's most hostile, unforgiving environments did not simply vanish because she had traded a plate carrier for scrubs. She walked past the trauma bays, her rubber-soled nursing clogs making no sound on the floorboards. Dr. Arthur Sterling, the chief of trauma surgery, barked an order at an orderly to fetch more O-negative blood from the bank. Sterling was a brilliant surgeon, but profoundly arrogant. a man who believed he was the absolute god of his operating room. Amelia avoided his gaze, maintaining her persona of the meek subordinate, and slipped into the medical supply closet adjacent to Bay 4 to restock her cart. The closet was cramped, smelling strongly of sterile plastic and alcohol prep pads. Through the narrow slatted window of the closet door, Amelia had a clear view of the two marshals and the heavily sedated Corliss. It was 9:42 p.m. The shift change was approaching, meaning the staff was tired, distracted, and looking at the clock. The security guard at the front desk, an older man named Gary, was likely doing his crossword puzzle. Amelia let out a slow, measured breath. She picked up a box of saline flushes. Just a normal night, she told herself. You left that life behind. You are Amelia Hayes. You live in a quiet apartment. You grow succulents. You save lives now. You don't take them. But as she reached for the top shelf, the overhead fluorescent lights flickered violently. Once, twice. Then, a sharp, metallic screech echoed from the ambulance bay doors at the rear of the department. It wasn't the sound of a gurney. It was the sound of a reinforced magnetic lock being blown apart by a breaching charge. The explosion wasn't deafening. It was a focused, suppressed concussion. The kind of shaped charge used by professionals who wanted entry without instantly alerting the entire city block. But in the enclosed space of the hospital, it was enough to shatter the mundane reality of the ER. The heavy double doors of the ambulance bay blew inward, flying off their hinges and crashing into a row of empty striker stretchers. A dense cloud of gray smoke rolled into the hallway. Elena shrieked, dropping her coffee mug. It shattered on the floor, brown liquid pooling into the pristine white tiles. "Doctor," Sterling froze mid-sentence, the blood bags slipping from the orderly's hands. From the smoke emerged 6 figures. They moved with terrifying, synchronized fluidity. There was no shouting, no chaotic waving of weapons. They wore unmarked black tactical gear, Kevlar vests, and ballistic helmets with drop-down visors. In their hands were compact, suppressed Heckler and Koch HK 416 assault rifles. Amelia, still inside the supply closet, didn't gasp. Her heart rate, which would normally spike in a civilian, paradoxically began to drop. The adrenaline hit her system, but it was cold, familiar, and instantly metabolized into razor-sharp focus. Through the slats of the door, she watched the choreography of the assault. It was textbook bounding Overwatch. 2 men fanned out to the left, securing the triage desk and forcing the screaming nurses to the floor. 2 more covered the main corridor, aiming their rifles at the security cameras and firing quick, silenced bursts. Pft, 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 shattering the lenses. The leader, a massive man whose vest bore only a faint, dirt-smudged call sign patch that read, William, advanced straight toward Bay 4. The U.S. Marshals, to their credit, reacted. But they were federal law enforcement trained for apprehension, not combat infantry trained for close-quarters battle. Agent Miller drew his Glock, shouting, "Federal agents, drop your—" He didn't finish the sentence. William didn't even break stride. He raised his rifle and fired a double tap into Miller's center mass, following instantly with a shot to the head. Miller crumpled against the glass of the ICU cubicle, painting it crimson. Agent Davis scrambled backward, wildly firing his weapon toward the smoke. His shots went wide, shattering a heart monitor and blowing out the glass of Bay 3. One of the mercenaries, flanking William, calmly stepped out of the blind spot Amelia had noticed earlier, near the linen carts, leveled his weapon, and put a single round through the side of Davis's neck. The marshal collapsed, clutching his throat, his blood bubbling onto the linoleum. Total time elapsed from the breach to the neutralization of the armed guards. 12 seconds. Secure the perimeter. No one moves, no one talks, and you all get to go home to your families. William's voice boomed. It was a deep, raspy baritone, carrying a faint Eastern European accent. He didn't yell. He projected authority. The ER went dead silent, save for the rhythmic sobbing of an orderly and the frantic, erratic beeping of disconnected medical monitors. Dr. Sterling, pale and shaking, was on his knees, with his hands locked behind his head. Elena was curled into a fetal position under the triage desk. Amelia remained perfectly still in the shadows of the supply closet. She analyzed the men. 6 total. High-end gear. Suppressed weapons. Their movements indicated Tier 1 military background or elite private military contractors. They weren't here to shoot up a hospital. They were here for an extraction or an assassination. Given that William was currently dragging a terrified, bleeding Dr. Sterling toward Bay 4, it was an extraction. They needed Corliss alive, and they needed a doctor to keep him stable during transport. "You!" William barked at Dr. Sterling, pointing the muzzle of his rifle at the surgeon's face. "The witness. Disconnect him from the wall monitors and bag him. We are moving him. He has a chest tube," Dr. Sterling stammered, his usual arrogance entirely evaporated. "If you move him in the cold, he'll drop a lung. He'll bleed out." William pressed the hot suppressor of his rifle against Sterling's cheek. The doctor whimpered. "Then you better be very good at your job, doctor. Bag him, now." While the leader focused on the VIP, the other 5 mercenaries spread out. 1 guarded the shattered rear exit. 2 held the main lobby doors, keeping the terrified patients and staff hostage. The remaining 2 began to sweep the adjacent rooms, clearing the area to ensure no one was calling the Seattle Police Department. "They're doing a systematic sweep," Amelia thought. "They'll hit this closet in less than 30 seconds. She looked down at her hands. They were completely steady. The peaceful life she had painstakingly built over the last 3 years. The quiet shifts, the mundane conversations, the anonymity was disintegrating with every second. If she stayed in the closet, she would be found, rounded up with the others, and likely used as a human shield during their exfiltration. If Corliss was taken, people would die. If the Seattle PD SWAT team showed up and breached blindly, half the hospital staff would be caught in the crossfire. Amelia unclipped her Street Jude's employee badge and slipped it into her pocket. She reached up and pulled the scrunchie from her hair, tying it back into a tighter, unyielding knot. Her eyes scanned the medical supplies around her. A combat medic doesn't need an armory to wage war. A hospital is a warehouse of lethal chemicals and blunt instruments, if you know how to use them. She grabbed a heavy, steel-grade D-size oxygen tank from the corner, weighing about 15 pounds. In her left hand, she palmed a pair of titanium trauma shears, the serrated kind, designed to cut through motorcycle leathers and Kevlar. Lastly, she grabbed a pre-filled syringe of epinephrine from the crash cart surplus box. Heavy footsteps approached the supply closet. Through the slatted glass, Amelia saw the silhouette of one of the mercenaries. He was young, moving casually, clearly assuming the civilian staff was fully pacified. He reached for the handle of the closet door. Amelia stepped to the side, pressing her back against the wall, perfectly aligning herself with the hinge of the door. She slowed her breathing. In, out. The door swung open. The mercenary stepped in, his rifle leading the way. The closet was dark. For a fraction of a second, his eyes had to adjust from the bright fluorescent lights of the hallway to the dim interior. That fraction of a second was all Amelia needed. She swung the heavy steel oxygen tank in a brutal, tight arc, bypassing the mercenary's Kevlar helmet and smashing it directly into his exposed jawline. The sickening crunch of bone echoed in the tiny room. Before the man could even register the trauma, before a sound could escape his throat, Amelia dropped the tank, grabbed his tactical vest with her left hand to keep him from falling backward into the hallway, and drove the titanium trauma shears deep into the vulnerable gap between his body armor and his collarbone. The mercenary convulsed, his eyes rolling back in shock. Amelia caught his heavy HK 416 rifle as it slipped from his hands, easing his limp body to the floor with practiced, silent grace. She looked down at the unconscious, bleeding man at her feet. She picked up his rifle, feeling the familiar, cold weight of the weapon in her grip. She checked the safety selector, sliding it with a soft click. Amelia Hayes, the invisible nurse, was gone. Amelia knelt beside the unconscious mercenary, the metallic scent of his blood already mingling with the sterile odor of the supply closet. She worked with a terrifying, mechanical efficiency, her hands moving with a muscle memory that felt like a phantom limb suddenly reattaching itself. She stripped his encrypted Motorola tactical radio from his shoulder harness, pressing the molded earpiece into her left ear. She bypassed his sidearm, but retrieved 2 spare 30-round magazines for the HK 416, sliding the heavy steel into the deep, reinforced pockets of her oversized scrub pants. Finally, her fingers brushed against the rigid Kydex sheath of a fixed-blade Strider tactical knife strapped to his chest rig. She pulled it free, testing the grip. "Bravo 2, sit rep. Is the rear annex clear?" The voice crackling in her ear was sharp, laced with the same heavy Eastern European accent as the leader, William. Amelia didn't key the microphone. Silence was a powerful weapon, but it was also a ticking clock. In exactly 30 seconds, William would realize his man wasn't responding to radio checks. In 45 seconds, he would send a fire team to investigate. She stepped over the fallen man and slipped out of the closet. Instead of heading back toward the chaotic center of the ER where the hostages were grouped, Amelia moved deeper into the hospital's shadow architecture. St. Jude's was a brutalist structure, built in the 1970s, heavily retrofitted over the decades. Behind the pristine drywall and acoustic drop ceilings were interstitial service corridors, designed for Siemens HVAC maintenance and pneumatic tube routing. Amelia had mapped every inch of these hidden arteries during her first week. Old habits like identifying secondary egress routes and choke points never truly died. She bypassed the main hallway, slipping through an unmarked door that read, "Authorized maintenance personnel only." It locked behind her with a soft click. The service hallway was narrow, illuminated only by caged, industrial yellow bulbs. It ran parallel to the main trauma bays, terminating directly behind the nurse's station where Elena and the others were being held. Through the thin drywall, Amelia could hear the muffled, terrified weeping of a young pediatric nurse. "Shut her up, Grigori," William's voice boomed, clear even through the plaster. "We are on a timeline. Dr. Sterling, if you do not have that chest tube clamped and the transport ventilator secured in exactly 2 minutes, I will shoot you in the knee. Then, I will force you to do it while bleeding out. I need more propofol." Sterling's voice was reedy, panicked, stripped entirely of his usual God-complex bravado. "He's fighting the sedation. If he wakes up while we move him, he'll tear the sutures." "Then get it," William ordered. "Grigori, take the doctor to the dispensary. Watch his hands." Amelia stopped moving. The Pyxis Med Station dispensary was located in the central hub, right at the intersection of corridors A and B. It was an exposed area with sight lines from 3 different directions. If Grigori and the doctor moved there, they would pass directly by an air return vent Amelia was currently standing next to. She quietly removed the aluminum grate of the vent, setting it softly on the concrete floor. Peering through the opening, she had a perfect ankle-level view of the brightly lit hospital corridor. Heavy, combat-booted footsteps approached, contrasting with the frantic, squeaking shuffle of Dr. Sterling's clogs. "Hurry up, old man," Grigori grunted. He was a mountain of a man, carrying a heavy breeching shotgun, slung across his back in addition to his primary rifle. As they paused in front of the automated medication dispenser, Sterling's hands shook so violently, he dropped his keycard. "Pick it up," Grigori sneered, looking away for just a fraction of a second to scan the hallway. It was all the opening Amelia needed. She didn't use the rifle. The close quarters and the proximity to the doctor made a firearm too risky. Instead, she pushed herself up into the ductwork, silently sliding headfirst out of the ventilation shaft and dropping into the corridor directly behind the massive mercenary. Grigori heard the soft thud of her landing. He spun around, his eyes widening as he registered the small, unassuming nurse in the oversized scrubs. He opened his mouth to shout, raising his rifle. Amelia moved faster than his brain could process the visual anomaly. She stepped inside his guard, grabbing the hot barrel of his rifle with her left hand and shoving it upward, away from her center mass. Simultaneously, she drove the Strider knife upward in a brutal, practiced thrust, slipping the blade cleanly under the bottom edge of his Kevlar vest and burying it deep into his liver. Grigori gasped, the breath rushing out of his lungs in a wet hiss. Before he could pull the trigger or cry out, Amelia clamped her bloodied hand over his mouth. She twisted the blade sharply, then withdrew it, instantly wrapping her arm around his thick neck in a blood choke. He thrashed wildly, but Amelia used his own massive weight against him, sweeping his leg and riding him down to the floor. She held the choke with terrifying, emotionless strength. 5 seconds. 10 seconds. Grigori's frantic struggling slowed, his eyes rolling back as the brain was starved of oxygen. At 15 seconds, he went completely limp. Dr. Sterling, who had retrieved his keycard, finally turned around. He stared at the scene, his jaw unhinged in absolute, paralyzing horror. He looked at the massive, heavily armed man, unconscious on the floor in a pool of blood, and then up at Amelia. Her face was spattered with crimson, her eyes dead and cold. "Amelia?" Dr. Sterling whispered, his mind fracturing at the impossibility of what he was seeing. "What? What are you?" "Quiet, Doctor," Amelia said, her voice dropping its usual soft, deferential tone, replaced by an authoritative steel that made Sterling flinch. "Finish getting the propofol. Keep your head down. When William asks what took so long, you tell him the machine jammed. But they'll kill us," Sterling sobbed quietly. "They are going to kill you anyway, once they have Corliss in the extraction vehicle," Amelia stated matter-of-factly, dragging Grigori's heavy body toward the open maintenance door. "You are a liability. Keep them stalled. 5 minutes. Can you do that, Arthur?" Sterling swallowed hard, terrified of the men holding the hospital hostage, but suddenly equally terrified of the quiet nurse, who always made sure his coffee was hot. He nodded, frantically. Amelia pulled Grigori into the dark service hallway, securing the door behind her. Suddenly, her earpiece chirped twice. "Bravo 2, Bravo 3. Neither of you are responding," William's voice crackled, the calm authority now edged with a lethal, rising tension. "Report immediately, or I execute the triage nurse." Amelia's blood ran cold. He meant Elena. William was not a man who made idle threats. Amelia knew the psychology of a mercenary commander. Violence was currency, and he needed to spend some to regain control of a situation that was quietly slipping through his fingers. In the main triage area, William grabbed Elena by the collar of her floral print scrubs, hauling the terrified 50-year-old woman to her feet. He pressed the muzzle of a Glock 17 against her temple. The other hostages screamed, burying their faces into the floor. "I know someone is listening," William's voice echoed through the ER, projecting loudly enough to carry down the corridors. "I have 2 men missing. That means we have a hero in the building, maybe a cop who slipped the net, maybe a brave security guard. I will count to 10. If you do not step out into the open with your hands on your head, this woman's brains will decorate the whiteboard." Amelia was 50 yards away, moving silently through the dark maintenance corridor. She had to force his hand, change his geometry, and break his focus. She couldn't just walk out, she'd be gunned down instantly, and Elena would likely die in the crossfire. She needed a distraction, one massive enough to pull William's attention away from the hostage. She broke into a sprint, heading toward the hospital's localized oxygen storage matrix, located near the ambulance bay doors. Hospitals rely on massive, pressurized liquid oxygen tanks to feed the wall lines in the trauma bays. The localized manifold in the ER was heavily reinforced, but it had an emergency release valve designed for fire suppression protocols. "1," William called out. Amelia reached the matrix. She grabbed a heavy wrench from a nearby maintenance cart and smashed the glass covering the emergency override controls. 2, 3. The voice echoed from the central hub. Amelia bypassed the digital fail-safes, manually turning the heavy, brass bleed valve. The pressure gauge spiked. She grabbed a nearby defibrillator unit from a crash cart, ripped the adhesive pads off, and exposed the raw wiring. 4, 5. Your time is running out, hero. She wedged the exposed wires of the defibrillator against the metal housing of the oxygen manifold, setting the machine to max joules. Then, she tied a length of surgical tourniquet tubing around the charge and shock buttons, creating a crude tension release trigger. 6, 7. Elena was sobbing uncontrollably now, pleading for her life. Amelia backed away, raising the captured HK-416 rifle. She aimed carefully down the holographic sight, targeting the stretched rubber tubing on the defibrillator. 8, 9. Crack. Amelia fired a single, suppressed round. The bullet severed the surgical tubing perfectly. The buttons on the defibrillator depressed. The machine unleashed 360 joules of electricity directly into the localized oxygen cloud, venting from the manifold. The explosion didn't shatter the building, but it was spectacular. A concussive shockwave of blue-white fire blew out the remaining glass in the ambulance bay, triggering the hospital's catastrophic fire alarms. A deafening, mechanized wail immediately filled the building, accompanied by the blinding, strobing flash of emergency strobe lights. The overhead sprinklers engaged, raining freezing water down onto the linoleum. In the central hub, William flinched, instinctively pulling his weapon away from Elena's head to cover the corridor where the explosion had occurred. The 2 mercenaries guarding the front doors abandoned their posts, rushing toward the smoke-filled hallway, and weapons raised. "Hold your positions. Do not break the perimeter," William roared over the blaring alarms. But the discipline of his men was cracking. Amelia didn't wait to admire her handiwork. Using the chaos, the smoke, and the torrential downpour of the sprinkler system as cover, she moved like a ghost. She bypassed the 2 men rushing toward the explosion, slipping into the trauma bay directly behind William. Dr. Sterling was cowering under a gurney, clutching a vial of propofol. Corliss, the VIP, was thrashing weakly on his bed, the sedation wearing off just as William had feared. William, realizing the explosion was a diversion, spun back toward the hostages. "Wyatt, secure the flank," he yelled into his radio, water pouring off his Kevlar helmet. Amelia stepped out from the shadows of Bay 4. She didn't announce herself. She raised her rifle and fired a controlled 3-round burst. The rounds struck Wyatt, the mercenary guarding the left flank center mass. His advanced body armor stopped the penetration, but the kinetic impact of 56 rounds hitting him at 2,900 feet per second was like being hit by a truck. He was thrown backward over a crash cart. The wind knocked completely out of him. William whipped around, locking eyes with Amelia. For a split second, confusion registered on his hardened face. He was looking for a SWAT officer in heavy tactical gear. Instead, he saw a soaking wet, mousy-haired nurse in oversized, blood-stained scrubs, holding a military-grade rifle with perfect textbook form. "You," William snarled, raising his weapon. Amelia dove laterally as William opened fire. Suppressed bullets chewed through the glass and drywall, where she had been standing a millisecond before, shattering monitors and sending sparks showering into the wet room. She hit the slick, water-covered floor and slid behind the heavy, lead-lined door of the portable X-ray annex. "Pin her down," William shouted, advancing cautiously, his rifle tracking her last known position. Amelia checked her magazine. 20 rounds left. She was pinned behind the lead door, bleeding sluggishly from a deep gash on her left forearm, where a piece of shrapnel from the monitors had caught her during the dive. The adrenaline was masking the pain, but she could feel the warm blood mixing with the cold sprinkler water. She ripped a piece of fabric from her scrub top, biting down hard on the end as she pulled it into a brutal, hasty tourniquet around her forearm. The heavy, methodical footsteps of William and his remaining men were closing in on the X-ray annex. They were flanking her. She was trapped in a room with only one exit. Suddenly, the blaring fire alarm abruptly cut off. The sudden silence in the ER was deafening, broken only by the hiss of the sprinklers and the terrified whimpers of the staff. Then, the hospital's public address system crackled to life. William had reached the main communication console at the triage desk. "I have to admit, you surprised me," William's voice boomed from the speakers above Amelia's head, echoing with a chilling, calm sociopathy. "Your movement, your weapon retention. You are not a nurse. You are a professional, a ghost, hiding in plain sight. But ghosts cannot stop bullets, and they cannot be in two places at once." Amelia tightened her grip on the rifle, controlling her breathing, refusing to give away her position with a cough or a heavy sigh. "I have the charge, Nurse Elena, kneeling in front of me." William's voice continued smoothly over the PA. "And I have Dr. Sterling. I also have the VIP. You have exactly 60 seconds to throw your weapon out of that room and walk out with your hands empty. If you do not, I will execute Elena. 30 seconds later, I will execute the doctor. I will bleed this hospital dry until you show yourself. The clock starts now." Amelia leaned her head back against the cold, lead-lined wall, closing her eyes. The water poured down her face. She was outmanned, outgunned, and cornered. The ordinary life of Amelia Hayes was officially dead. To save the people in this hospital, she had to resurrect the monster she used to be. The clock in Amelia's head ticked with the ruthless precision of a metronome. 55 seconds. The portable X-ray annex was a dead end. The lead-lined walls that protected the rest of the hospital from radiation were virtually bulletproof, but they also formed a perfect kill box. The heavy steel door was the only way in or out, and William's men were undoubtedly stacking up outside it, waiting for her to make a desperate, suicidal sprint. But hospitals are built on layers of infrastructure. Amelia looked up. The walls of the X-ray room went up to a height of 10 feet, finishing at a suspended grid of acoustic drop-ceiling tiles. In standard office buildings, the walls stop at the grid. In hospitals, fire code dictates that structural drywall must extend all the way to the true concrete ceiling above the plenum space to prevent fires from jumping between rooms. However, Amelia knew that retrofitted rooms like this temporary X-ray annex built in the late 90s often cheated. They ran heavy lead drywall up to the grid, but the space above was sometimes left open to accommodate the massive HVAC ducts required for negative pressure environments. 45 seconds. Amelia holstered the captured HK-416, letting it hang tight against her side on its two-point sling. She scrambled onto the heavy casing of the mobile X-ray machine, ignoring the sharp spike of pain from the hasty tourniquet on her left forearm. Reaching up, she pressed her flat palms against a chalky white acoustic tile and pushed. It lifted easily, sliding out of the metal grid. She pulled herself up into the suffocating darkness of the interstitial space. The air up here was dry, smelling heavily of fiberglass insulation and decades-old dust, a sharp contrast to the freezing, sprinkler-soaked ER below. She carefully balanced her weight on the primary aluminum crossbeams, knowing that stepping on the fragile tiles would send her crashing straight down onto the linoleum. 30 seconds, William's voice echoed, muffled but chillingly calm through the tiles beneath her. "Are you a coward, ghost?" "Elena is shaking. She has a daughter in college, she tells me." "A shame." Amelia crawled forward on her elbows and knees, her bloodied scrubs catching on exposed screws. She moved laterally, away from the X-ray room, tracking the path of the main corridor. Below her, through the narrow gaps in the lighting fixtures, she could see the beam of a tactical flashlight sweeping the X-ray door. It was Trent, another of William's mercenaries, covering the choke point. She bypassed him entirely, inching her way toward the central triage desk. 15 seconds. Elena's sobbing was audible now, raw and terrified. Amelia found a vent directly above the triage station. She peered through the slats. William was standing exactly where he had been, using Elena as a human shield. His Glock was pressed firmly against the back of the older nurse's head. Doctor. Sterling was on the floor nearby, curled into a ball, hands over his ears. Amelia couldn't shoot William from this angle. The vent slats were too thick, and shooting blindly through the acoustic tile risked the bullet, deflecting and hitting Elena or the doctor. She needed to change the geometry of the room. She needed William to look up. 10, 9, 8. Amelia drew the Strider knife. Next to the vent ran a thick bundle of heavy, black Cat6 data cables, suspended by a weak plastic zip tie. She sawed through the plastic binding in 3 frantic motions. 7, 6, 5. William thumbed back the hammer on his Glock. The metallic click was horrifyingly loud. Amelia kicked the vent grate out with the heel of her boot. Simultaneously, she shoved the massive bundle of heavy cables down through the opening. The heavy wires cascaded from the ceiling like a nest of black snakes, crashing directly onto the triage desk and William's shoulders with a loud, clattering impact. Human instinct is unavoidable. William flinched, ripping his weapon away from Elena's head and stepping back, raising his arms to ward off the sudden, falling debris. That microsecond of distraction was the only opening Amelia would get. She dropped through the open hole in the ceiling, falling 8 feet. She didn't try to land perfectly. She let gravity take her, collapsing into a combat roll over the slick, waterlogged triage desk, shattering a computer monitor as she went over. William roared, leveling his pistol at the falling figure, but he was a fraction of a second too late. Amelia came up from the roll on one knee, the HK-416 already shouldered. She didn't aim for William. He was heavily armored and partially obscured by the desk. Instead, she snapped her sights to the hallway to her right, where Trent was rushing in, drawn by the sound of the collapsing ceiling. A double tap of suppressed fire caught Trent perfectly in the T-box of his ballistic face shield. The reinforced glass spider-webbed, and the mercenary crumpled backward into the corridor, dead before he hit the floor. Amelia instantly tracked back to William, but the leader was already moving. Recognizing he had lost the tactical advantage, he grabbed the back of Dr. Sterling's collar, hauling the screaming surgeon up to his feet. He fired 3 blind shots from his Glock toward the desk, forcing Amelia to duck beneath the shattered laminate wood. "Wyatt, fall back to Bay 4. We are extracting the package now." William barked into his radio, dragging the thrashing surgeon backward down the main corridor toward the trauma bays, where David Corliss was still strapped to a bed. Amelia stayed low, the cold water from the sprinklers soaking through her scrubs. She looked over at Elena, who was hyperventilating on the floor, untouched, but completely paralyzed by shock. "Elena," Amelia said, her voice cutting through the hiss of the water. It wasn't the soft, polite voice of the new girl. It was an absolute command. "Look at me." Elena blinked, her terrified eyes locking onto Amelia's cold, focused gaze. "Crawl under the reinforced crash cart counter. Do not come out until you hear police sirens. Do you understand?" Elena nodded numbly, scrambling backward on her hands and knees into the dark recess of the cabinetry. Amelia checked her magazine. 12 rounds left. She took a deep breath, the metallic taste of adrenaline sharp on her tongue. It was time to finish this. The ER was a labyrinth of shattered glass, flashing strobe lights, and pouring water. The silence that followed the gunfire was suffocating. Amelia moved methodically, piecing the corners of the main hallway. Her footsteps were completely silent, masked by the steady drumming of the sprinkler system. She reached the threshold of Bay 3. Bay 4 was just ahead. Inside, William was screaming at Wyatt to secure Corliss to a portable transport gurney. "The IV line is tangled," Wyatt yelled, panic bleeding into his voice. He was favoring his ribs heavily, clearly suffering from broken bones, where Amelia's initial burst had impacted his body armor. "Rip it out," William commanded. "We breach the loading dock in 60 seconds. If the doctor doesn't push the gurney fast enough, shoot him and drag the VIP by his ankles." Amelia pressed her back against the wall between the two bays. She reached into her deep scrub pocket and pulled out a small, metallic object she had pocketed from the supply closet earlier, a heavy, steel reflex hammer. She tossed the hammer underhanded across the hallway. It skittered across the wet linoleum, clattering loudly against a metal linen bin on the far side of the corridor. Wyatt took the bait. He stepped out of Bay 4, his rifle raised, tracking the sound. He exposed his left flank to the wall, where Amelia was waiting. Amelia stepped out, grabbing the hot barrel of Wyatt's rifle and violently jerking it downward. Before he could pull the trigger, she drove the buttstock of her own weapon upward, smashing it brutally under Wyatt's chin. His head snapped back with a sickening crack. As he fell, Amelia caught his tactical rig, gently lowering him to the floor to prevent the heavy thud of his body from alerting William. 5 down, 1 to go. She peeked around the glass partition into Bay 4. William was standing with his back to the door, one hand tightly gripping the back of Dr. Sterling's neck, the other holding his Glock leveled at Corliss's chest. The VIP was groggy, coughing weakly, as Sterling frantically tried to unlock the wheels of the transport stretcher. Amelia stepped fully into the doorway. She leveled her rifle at William's broad, Kevlar-clad back. "Drop it, William," Amelia said. Her voice was flat, devoid of the theatricality the mercenary had used on the PA system. William froze. He didn't turn around. Slowly, a low, raspy chuckle escaped his throat. "I have to admit, I underestimated you," William said, his accent thick in the humid air of the room. "You took out my entire unit. Elite men, expensive men. Who handles your contracts? Are you agency? Syndicate?" "I'm a nurse," Amelia replied coldly. William laughed again, tightening his grip on Dr. Sterling. The surgeon whimpered, his eyes wide with pleading terror, as he looked at Amelia. "If you shoot me, my hand spasms. The doctor gets a hollow point through the spine. If you try for a headshot, I might still pull the trigger in the reflex." "You're right," Amelia said, "which is why I'm not aiming at you." William frowned, a flicker of confusion crossing his features. He turned his head slightly to look over his shoulder. Amelia shifted her aim 2 feet to the right and fired a single round. The bullet struck the massive, pressurized wall-mounted oxygen regulator, situated directly behind William. The high-velocity round shattered the brass valve casing. Instantly, highly pressurized, freezing oxygen blasted out of the wall at 50 pounds per square inches, creating a deafening hiss and a blinding white cloud of condensed vapor right in William's face. The blast of freezing gas hit William's eyes, blinding him instantly. He cried out in shock and pain, instinctively throwing his hands up to protect his face. He dropped Dr. Sterling and fired a wild, reflexive shot into the ceiling. Amelia closed the distance in 3 long strides. As William stumbled backward, coughing in the thick white vapor, Amelia drove a brutal front kick into the back of his knee. The joint gave out with a loud pop. William collapsed, roaring in agony. But the mercenary was a survivor. Even on the ground, blinded and crippled, he blindly swung his pistol toward Amelia's general direction. Amelia didn't hesitate. She stepped heavily onto his gun hand, her boot pinning his wrist to the wet floor. With her left hand, she drew the Strider knife and drove it precisely through the thick meat of William's shoulder, pinning him to the linoleum. William screamed, his fingers splaying open, the Glock sliding uselessly out of his grip. Amelia kicked the weapon under a nearby cabinet. She stared down at the mercenary leader, her chest heaving slightly, the cold, emotionless mask firmly in place. "You're done," Amelia said quietly. Suddenly, the piercing wail of police sirens cut through the ambient noise of the hospital. Red and blue lights began to stroke frantically through the shattered windows of the ambulance bay. The Seattle SWAT teams had finally arrived, entirely unaware that the war inside Street Jude's was already over. Dr. Sterling, trembling uncontrollably, slowly pushed himself up from the floor. He looked at the groaning mercenary, the blood pooling in the water, and then at Amelia. She was soaked, bleeding, and surrounded by a trail of bodies she had systematically dismantled. "Amelia," Sterling whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of profound awe and absolute terror. "Who? What are you?" Amelia looked at the terrified surgeon, and then down at her blood-stained scrubs. The quiet, ordinary life she had built was shattered beyond repair. She had saved the hospital, but she had lost her sanctuary. "I told you, doctor," Amelia said, reaching up to pull the tight scrunchie from her wet hair, letting it fall loose around her shoulders. "I'm just the new nurse." The breach was a textbook display of overwhelming force. Seattle Police Department's SWAT Alpha Squad, led by veteran Commander David Harrison, poured through the shattered ambulance bay doors and the main lobby simultaneously. They moved with aggressive precision, sweeping the angles with tactical flashlights mounted to their short-barreled M4 rifles, expecting a brutal, protracted firefight. Instead, they found a graveyard of elite mercenaries. "Clear. Lobby is clear," an officer shouted over the din of the fire alarms, which were finally being deactivated by the arriving fire department. Commander Harrison stepped over the unconscious body of Grigori in the interstitial hallway, his heavy boots splashing in the pooling water. His eyes scanned the devastation. The localized oxygen manifold was blown to pieces. High-end, suppressed HK-416 rifles lay discarded on the wet linoleum. Every single hostile was either dead, unconscious, or incapacitated with brutal, surgical efficiency. When Harrison's squad finally reached Trauma Bay 4, they kept their weapons raised. "Seattle PD, show me your hands!" Dr. Arthur Sterling was sitting on the floor, leaning against a stainless steel counter, his scrubs soaked in water and blood. He slowly raised his trembling hands. Beside him, David Corliss, the federal informant, was still strapped to the gurney, groaning as the sedation finally wore off. William, the mercenary leader, was pinned to the floor by the Strider knife, buried in his shoulder, his knee bent at an unnatural angle. He was pale, gritting his teeth in silent, venomous rage as two SWAT officers roughly zip-tied his wrists. "Who did this?" Harrison barked, his flashlight beam cutting through the dissipating steam. "Where is the shooter?" Dr. Sterling didn't speak. He just pointed a shaking finger toward the decontamination sinks at the far end of the trauma corridor. There, standing perfectly still under the harsh, fluorescent lights, was Amelia. She had stripped off her blood-soaked scrub top and was wearing a plain gray undershirt. She was meticulously washing the blood and chemical residue from her hands with strong, iodine-based surgical soap. She didn't look up as 4 SWAT officers leveled their rifles at her back. "Put your hands where I can see them. Now," Harrison ordered. Amelia turned off the faucet with her elbow, a sterile habit, and slowly raised her hands. Her face was completely devoid of emotion. "The area is secure, Commander," she said, her voice carrying the calm, steady cadence of a seasoned tactical operator. "You have 5 hostiles neutralized. The VIP is stable, but requires immediate transport to a secure facility. The remaining civilian staff are sheltering under the triage desk." Harrison frowned, lowering his rifle a fraction of an inch. "Who the hell are you?" Before Amelia could answer, a loud commotion erupted near the triage desk. Detective Sarah Jenkins, the lead homicide investigator, who had just arrived on the scene, was trying to push past a man in a sharply tailored, charcoal gray suit. "Sir, this is an active crime scene. You cannot," Jenkins started. The man ignored her entirely. He flashed a laminated identification card, encased in a leather wallet, that immediately made Commander Harrison pale. The badge didn't say FBI, or ATF, or Marshal Service. It bore the seal of the Department of Defense, flanked by acronyms that most local cops only heard about in rumors. The man walked straight through the waterlogged corridor, bypassing the moaning mercenaries and the bewildered SWAT team. He stopped 10 feet from Amelia. "Agent Kessler," Amelia said softly, dropping her hands. She reached for a paper towel and began to dry her fingers. "It's been 3 years, Amelia," Kessler replied. His voice was smooth, carrying no surprise at the carnage around him. "We told you that you couldn't hide forever. The syndicate doesn't forget, and apparently they finally tracked Corliss to your backyard. You just happened to be on the wrong shift." "I was doing my job," Amelia said, tossing the paper towel into a biohazard bin. "You did your old job," Kessler corrected, gesturing to William, who was now being loaded onto a stretcher by heavily guarded paramedics. "And you did it flawlessly. But your cover here is blown. The local news is already setting up satellite trucks outside. Within an hour, every camera in Seattle will be pointed at Street Jude's. If your face ends up on a broadcast, the people you used to hunt will know exactly where you are." Amelia looked past Kessler. At the end of the hall, Elena was being wrapped in a mylar shock blanket by a paramedic. The older nurse caught Amelia's eye. There was no gratitude in Elena's stare, only absolute paralyzing fear. "Doctor." Sterling was being interviewed by Detective Jenkins, but he kept throwing terrified, erratic glances in Amelia's direction. They didn't see a hero. They saw a killer, a ghost, who had seamlessly infiltrated their lives. "I have a life here," Amelia whispered, the first crack of emotion showing in her voice. "I have an apartment. I have a cat, Thomas." "I'll have a team retrieve the cat," Kessler said, not unkindly. He pulled a heavy, dark raincoat from his arm and held it out to her. "But Amelia Hayes died tonight in this hospital. It's time to come back in from the cold." Amelia stared at the raincoat for a long moment. She looked at the blood on her shoes, the shattered glass reflecting the flashing police lights, and the hospital that had been her sanctuary. She had fought desperately to save the people inside it, but in doing so, she had sacrificed the only peace she had ever known. Without another word, she slipped her arms into the heavy coat, turning up the collar to obscure her face. Kessler nodded to Commander Harrison. "This facility is now under federal jurisdiction. You will gag your officers, Commander. This woman was never here. The marshals fought off the assault. Understood?" Harrison, looking at the impossible trail of destruction the small nurse had left in her wake, swallowed hard and nodded. Amelia walked out through the rear loading dock, flanked by Kessler and 2 silent men in tactical gear who had materialized from the shadows. She didn't look back. The cold Seattle rain washed the last remaining traces of Street Jude's from her boots as she climbed into the back of an unmarked, armored SUV. The door slammed shut with a heavy, metallic thud, and the vehicle vanished into the dark, wet streets, leaving the ordinary world behind. The events at Street Jude's Medical Center became an urban legend in Seattle, officially recorded as a heroic, albeit tragic, last stand by 2 fallen U.S. Marshals. But the hospital staff knew the truth. They scrubbed the blood from the linoleum and replaced the shattered glass. But the psychological remnants of that night lingered. Elena never complained about the new hires again, and Dr. Sterling's arrogant demands vanished, replaced by a quiet, haunted humility. The story of Amelia Hayes serves as a chilling reminder of the world's hidden realities. The most dangerous individuals rarely look the part. They do not wear capes or announce their presence. They are the quiet neighbors, the polite strangers, and the forgettable faces in oversized scrubs. They hide in plain sight, hoping for peace, but always ready for war. Amelia sought an ordinary life, but in the end, blood always reveals the truth.